When you become president, you are in line for the most dangerous job in the entire world. 15% of all presidents have been shot while running for office or while in office.
Europe, you need to step up and pay your damn money supporting what NATO is, because the reality is the US is pretty much floating NATO initiatives and funding and actions everywhere.
This is the most strong statement that I could ever imagine being put out.
And then you really think about it, you're like, holy, this is really sad. We're poisoning our children. How are we allowing this crap? This is fucked up. What are we doing to our kids?
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name is Austin Bronner, and I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. How you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm pumped. Literally
How
pumped.
Are you feeling
Everything's
right
pumping.
Now? What's that?
I said I'm pumped. Everything's pumping. I think everyone's literally pumped, and maybe a little bit too pumped. Getting a little bit scared right now. I'm talking about crypto. I'm talking about the stock market. I'm talking about the positive, euphoric emotions it feels like that are going on, especially in the finance world.
Euphoria is everywhere in the finance world, and it's definitely very interesting when you think about the amount of momentum, right? Like we did this episode last week about the unexpected the impact of Trump's second presidency, and then boom, over the last week, there's just been almost euphoria in the markets. And yeah, I feel similar to you where I'm kind of like pleasantly surprised, but also a little nervous because you never know, when things feel so good, being invested for a long time in the markets, you never know when the other shoe's going to drop.
I feel personally pretty good. I made a lot of investment decisions positioned for a Trump win, and they're playing off very, very well right now. But they're playing so well, and I know this sounds crazy that I'd be complaining about my investments doing so well, but I've never seen anything happen like this in a matter of several days. So there's this part of me that's just saying, be careful, consider getting out of some of these positions. Of course, the market can stay. What's the saying? The market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent.
Totally.
Although I wouldn't be losing money if I sell right now. I know that I might be missing a lot of upside. So that's definitely the little battle that's going on in my mind right now.
Well, today we're going to dive into 10 predictions for Trump's second term, and we're going to get really into some of the things that we think. We talked a lot about what we thought was going to happen up till the election, but now we want to talk about, okay, what do we think is going to happen going forward? But before we do, we want to dive in and talk a little bit about, we're hosting an investing dinner in Austin, Texas on February 20th, and you are invited. So Cody, why don't you give them a little bit of a rundown of what we're doing and why they might be interested in joining us on the 20th in Austin.
So I've hosted dinners around the world for the past decade, and it feels a little awkward when you go into a room with people you don't know, a bunch of, random investors, but, we're going to be able to attract like-minded people who are interested in international markets and the US market and niche investing opportunities. And when you throw a bunch of, successful, forward-thinking people in the same room, good things come out of it. So we're going to have this dinner in Austin. Austin's a great hub right now in terms of attracting a lot of talent, but also a lot of intellectually curious people. And we'll probably have a bunch of people fly in as well, and we'll have a great dinner. We'll have a couple presentations. Nothing will be a pitch. Nothing is being sold. In fact, that is an internal policy. You will not be getting pitched on anything, but you will be getting viewpoints from some very successful people about how they are currently making money right now and some things that they're going to be getting into soon. And no offer here, no specific, saying anything will happen, but it always happens where some deal comes out of the dinner, or somebody makes a business partnership, or somebody finds out some cool way to get involved in a new industry. And that's what happens when you put a lot of cool people that are doing forward things.
That's our goal, really, is just to bring together people that are doing interesting things, that have different ideas about where things are going, and talk about it and leave with some new ideas. So if you're interested, you can email Austin at adventurecapitalist.com, and we'll send you some more details about it. And if you sign up for the email list at adventurecapitalist.com, we'll also be there's some notes there as well in the emails that come out about the upcoming events. I'm excited. I'm very excited. I want to dive in here and talk about. I really spent some time thinking this last week, both of us, about what we think is going to happen from here on out, right? And there's been so much kind of like, in my opinion, built up energy thinking about what's going to happen. The elections, the biggest election of all time, the U.S. election is about to be decided. Is it going to go one way or the other? Now we know which direction it's going. What happens next? And so what we want to do is run down 10 of our predictions for the second term, and we'll kind of go back and forth. Cody and I did some brainstorming and give you some ideas of some of the things that we think are going to happen. And I will kick it off with number one. My number one prediction for the second term is that Trump gets shot again. Now, I want to dive into this because I started to kind of look at the numbers, right? Trump was already shot one time. We have a long history of assassinating inconvenient politicians. And really, all of our presidents, when you become president, you are in line for the most dangerous job in the entire world. I started to run some of the numbers. 15% of all presidents have been shot while running for office or while in office. So first off, it's dangerous no matter who you are. 25% have either been shot or targeted in a very credible assassination attempt. I did some research. There's a couple of other attempts where like the gun didn't go off, but they were standing right there. So 1 in 4 has been targeted in credible assassination attempts. And then you take it even further and you look at, okay, Trump has talked about some really, really intense reforms, plans to impose term limits on Congress, plans to root out corruption from intelligence agencies. All of these things, in my opinion, increase the likelihood of him getting taken out. So that is my prediction. 1, he gets shot again. And what happens after that is that leads to J.D. Vance being elected as the 48th president after Trump because of the pushback, because of like the swing back of what happens when a president gets shot again. I'm not going to say he's getting to get assassinated because I don't know, because that guy is like 9 lives.
Teflon Don.
Teflon Don.
I don't really want to talk about this too much because I feel like it's bad karma to talk about somebody getting shot. And this is not my prediction, although you're not the first person to say this in the past week. And let's just say the president or any huge political leader is a very, very dangerous job. Let's hope it doesn't happen. But you're right. He's completely challenging a ton of individuals, but also a ton of global initiatives. So he's absolutely a target. I also want to say that JD is somewhat of the poison pill, meaning if Trump gets eliminated, JD is next in line, which I could argue is worse for the people that want Trump gone. And so there's a little bit of that. And I think that was a strategy of picking JD, which is
probably. He's not something I'm hoping for, just something just a prediction.
Yep.
All right, Cody.
All right, my prediction. The second prediction, my first one is the U.S. turns towards isolationism. And I think there'll be 2 main things going on. Number one is the U.S. foreign policy, which I think it's going to be Marco Rubio, who's going to be Secretary of State. So that's
what I heard too.
I think that's going to be who's going around the world, dealing with other nations. In general, I think the strategy is going to be drastically different than what Anthony Blinken has pursued. And that's going to change so many things. We could spend an hour just talking about that, but let's just say foreign policy will drastically change. The second thing is that the U.S. will leave multiple different global alliances. So there's like,
what's your first one that they're going to leave?
I'm hesitant to start listing. I mean, it's tempting to want to pick like the main ones. I think NATO is a real organization. I think it's a real possibility. I think that Trump and Secretary of State, let's just call him Rubio for right now, if that is him, or whoever's going to be involved with that, are going to try to go to the negotiating table first. And what they're going to say is, Europe, you need to step up and pay your damn money for supporting what NATO is, because the reality is the US is pretty much floating NATO initiatives and funding and actions everywhere. So if we want to be a part of NATO, the rest of Europe needs to step up and fund their fair share. That's what I think they'll do first. If Europe does not step up and if they really push back, I do think there's a real possibility that we will leave NATO. And the implications there's so many trickle downs. I can't even think of them right off the top of my head. That said, I think there's a bunch of other environmental and geopolitical alliances, like for APEC, for example, the Asia Pacific Economic Consortium. There's like the Paris Accords. There's a bunch of other groups of why I think we'll leave them. And an example is, especially for the Paris Accords, the US is actually a leader in renewable energy and lowering their greenhouse emissions and doing all of these things that are good for the environment. And many of the countries that are part of these groups are lagging significantly. So why are we a member of these groups when we're adhering to all the initiatives we're pushing forward, but nobody else is? And we're spending money on these groups. It's ridiculous. So I think we're going to be pulling out of a lot of those groups. So those two things: foreign policy change, the relationship with countries, and then pulling out of these groups that exist all around the world.
I agree with you. And I'll throw in one more, that I think the Democratic Party is going to shift and take the same policy of isolationism that the Republicans had. And their foreign policy changes. Their foreign policy will look almost similar, exactly the same as Trump's in the next election. My prediction number 3 here: health in America is the big winner. I think with the full backing from the U.S. government, we're going to make strong progress in public health. And I want to start by just reading Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s tweet about public health and the FDA, because it makes his stance pretty darn clear. So he says, the FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk, hyperbaric therapies, chelating compounds, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamins, clean foods, sunshine, exercise, nutraceuticals, and anything else that advances human health and can't be patented by pharma. If you work for the FDA and are part of this corrupt system, I have 2 messages for you. 1, preserve your records, and 2, pack your bags. This is the most strong statement that I could ever imagine being put out about the direction that the U.S. government is going to go in terms of health and what's going to happen with the FDA. I think there's a couple of main things that I see. I think artificial colors and dyes are going to be banned, like they are in Europe. We really have a lot more lackadaisical standards related to we in the US. We have this idea that you need to prove that something is bad before it gets banned, and in Europe you have to prove that something is not going to hurt people before it's allowed to go in your food. I think that's one of the biggest changes that's going to happen, and I also think that regenerative agriculture is going to grow incredibly fast. One of the first, Thomas Massey, was pushed forth to be the I think the director of agriculture, and Joel Salatin, who is one of the largest and most prominent farmers in the regenerative agriculture movement, is one of the first announced advisors of the USDA. So that means we're not going to have to go to Mexico for like any of these experimental treatments. They should be opening up in the US, and I am very excited about that. I think any sort of business involved in natural health has a lot of opportunity over the next 4 years.
Totally agree. And I'm going to tell a funny story that's actually not that funny, because I'm not going to debate anything you said, because I'm on the same page of you. But my kids, they have birthday parties every weekend, and everybody who's listening to this who has kids knows how this goes. When you have a couple of kids and they're the age below 10, it seems like you always have birthday parties. There's this one kid I keep seeing. He's my son's age, about 5, at all the birthday parties. And he's a really nice kid. He's like really well behaved. But at every party, when I see him and he has dye on his lips, it's like he just ate candy. He acts like a freaking lunatic. It's like this kid has this like dye that he eats through the candy. And I've seen this like 3 or 4 times now at different parties. And the kid turns into a monster. And the rest of the time, he's a totally chill kid. And I bring the story up because it's kind of funny. I noticed it recently. I was like, oh my God, this kid is nuts when he has dye on his lips. It's like almost like he's a monster. And then you really think about it, you're like, holy, this is really sad. We're poisoning our children. How are we allowing this crap in foods? Obviously, this is candy this kid's eating, but this is fucked up. What are we doing to our kids? This is super messed up. And I'm glad that RFKs are the only apprehension I have, or just question I have, is where is he going to end up? Is he actually going to get a cabinet position? RFK, is he actually going to be in a position of power to influence the health in America? I hope he is. I hope he goes in and wrecks shop on all sorts of different 3-letter agencies that control public health. I hope he gets in there.
We'll find out. We'll find out soon. Prediction number 4. What do you got, Cody?
Number 4 down to my list. Where am I? Tariffs will work. And I know you disagree with this one, Austin. We'll get into
not necessarily. What does it mean?
So tariffs, just bigger picture, tariffs are charges that the U.S. is going to implement on other countries to do trade with the U.S. So if they want to bring in products or sell products to the U.S., they have to pay the U.S. a certain amount of a tariff, whether that's 10, 15, 20, 100%, 200%. Trump said recently he charged 200% tariffs on Chinese made vehicles that are made in Mexico because China was constructing auto plants in Mexico to get around the import issue. And then Trump was like, well, I'll just do 200% tariffs on your vehicles. And immediately they stopped construction on the auto plants in Mexico. So I don't think tariffs are like globally speaking, I don't think it's the best way to do business. But because America is so damn unique with its position on the earth, but also the position as an economy, I do think they'll work. And the country has a history of using tariffs before we had income taxes and property taxes and sales taxes and all these damn taxes that the U.S. citizen is being taxed on. The U.S. mostly survived on tariffs prior. So I do think there's a very strong argument for why tariffs could and should work if they're properly implemented.
And when you say work, how do you define a positive outcome?
So I'm picking on China here, but there's a lot of other countries that are guilty here. China most recently has cornered the market on rare earth metals. And what they're doing is they are mining rare earth metals all around the world, and then they're hoarding them within China. And then they're lowering the price of electronic devices or all sorts of products that use rare earth metals artificially because they control the rare earth metal market globally, which makes it impossible for any other economy, including America, to compete on these low-priced electronic devices. So they literally have a monopoly on this one, these elements. So a tariff would provide income to the U.S. when you're importing Chinese electronic goods. So the U.S. is actually making money on the tariff, but actually makes it competitive for electronic manufacturers within the U.S. to compete with or Chinese electronics that are sold in the domestic U.S. market. So that's an example of something that would work. Of course, there's tons of argument behind that exact example, but you could replicate that to many other goods and services and resources globally to explain why that would work is to make it competitive within the U.S.
I think when I think about one of the challenges with tariffs and why it really like messes with a lot of, you've got people that are very, very smart who are saying this is bad monetary policy, right? Bad monetary policy, the tariffs. But I think what they don't factor in is that it's more of like a strategic negotiation tool necessarily. That's one component that's not being factored in by economists, is that it's being used to negotiate. And I feel like my prediction with this tariffs is that, and why I don't know if I can say that they're going to work or not work. I do think they'll be used differently than people expect. And they'll be used in a way to negotiate and make things happen in a way that they might otherwise not happen.
I agree with that. And I think that is the disagreement politically right now, which is why are we using tariffs to do all these things? But the reality is we actually need tariffs. Another example I'll give really quickly is that the US has an enormous amount of intellectual capital. The iPhone is a great example. The iPhone has been completely developed in the US, California, right? It even says that, designed in California or whatever, but it's made in China. It has been by Foxconn. And then it's imported from China back into the US, and China is getting an enormous amount of that spread and the profit margin there. And a large part of that is the fact that they've cornered the market on a lot of the electronic
Sure.
resources to make the actual product. So the US is leading the way by developing this product, and they're outsourcing it to a different country. And then the US is getting screwed by China cornering the market on the products that are made to use the actual phone. And so that's, again, we're focusing on electronics here, but you could use that for food goods. You could use that for all types of different products. And the reality is that the US has an enormous amount of intellectual capital. And in order to make our progress fair economically, we need tariffs to control or balance those trade differences with other countries.
Interesting. I think this is going to be one of the biggest questions of this next 4 years is how are tariffs going to, how are they actually going to be used, right? What is just hyperbole and what is going to be, where does the rubber like meet the road, and where is it going to be used, and how is it going to be actually implemented? I'm very interested. All right. Prediction for me, number 5, Bitcoin hits 200K and gold hits $4,500 an ounce over in the next 4 years. Here's a couple reasons why. One, I really do believe that there's going to become a strategic reserve for Bitcoin in the US. This is a bipartisan thing now. It's not just one side. Trump talked about it. RFK talked about it. And then you've got someone like Ro Khanna, who also has talked about how they want to have openness. Quote, we want to make sure that we have openness to having Bitcoin as part of the Federal Reserve and as a reserve asset because of its potential for appreciation, because of its potential to allow America to set the financial standards. So you're now seeing people on both sides of the aisle talking about this. And I see it as a massive part of trying to solve this incredibly challenging issue of our massive deficit. And if interest rates stay higher for longer, which is another prediction that I think we're going to have interest rates higher for much longer than people expect. Well, Bitcoin, as it appreciates, can be used to pay down the deficit if it's used as a strategic reserve. I also think that gold goes significantly higher because there's really nowhere to run from inflation. And so central banks are going to continue to buy gold, and you'll see people continue to buy gold as a hedge. And it could get real crazy and go up even faster if there's some sort of an event like a war escalates or some sort of a really unexpected but large event happens. I just think both those things are winners over the next 4 years. Not necessarily in the short term. I think gold is going to continue to drop in the short term, but long term, it's a good investment.
Agreed. I'll just add that the price prediction that you've made here, so gold to 4,500, is less than doubling of the current gold price. So let's just say gold's like 2,800 an ounce, or actually way lower. It's like 2,600 an ounce right now.
2,600. Yeah.
Okay, well then it's just under half of what gold is right now. And the price prediction you have for Bitcoin is well over double what Bitcoin is right now. My point is, if you're going to make a bet of where you want the biggest gain, Bitcoin is where it should be based on your price prediction, which, by the way,
based on my price prediction. Yeah. And also, but within that price prediction, the interesting thing is that Bitcoin is just so much more volatile than gold. So you got to be comfortable with it potentially going down 75% overnight or 50% overnight and then coming back as, if you want more alpha, need more volatility. This transitions next to some of the reason why I think Bitcoin might move. Your prediction number 6. What do we got here?
China prints, and then they print, and then they print some more. And let's just face it, China's in some pretty big, they're in a bad situation for a number of reasons. I think everyone likes to point to their real estate market, which is in a big bubble.
Why are they, for people who don't know, why are they in trouble with their real estate market?
Well, let's just say that they've had this boom over the past couple of decades based upon this need to supply a growing demographic of people, meaning the population got bigger, they're consuming, they built all this housing up, everyone speculated on real estate, and now their demographics are changing, which is they're not having a ton of young people to support this massive amount of growth that they've had. And the speculation on all these properties has more or less gone away, meaning people are caught holding the bag on these properties that they bought, and the prices aren't continuing to skyrocket like they were. I'll also say another thing that is not really talked about because it's not really certain, but everyone's seen those videos of the ghost cities of China being
Oh
blown
yeah.
up, and you see like a building blown up, like a controlled demolition, but it's not just one building. It's like literally 6, 7, 8 buildings in a row, and they're brand new. And you're thinking, what is going on here? And there's always a story, oh, they use faulty concrete, or oh, they changed their mind, or oh, this or that. But it's not just one or two videos of these circulating around online. It's like dozens, maybe more than that, of these buildings being blown up. And there's a pretty strong argument to say that the Chinese uh, purposely built all this real estate to put people to work to stimulate their economy. There wasn't enough demand to purchase this real estate that they built, so they're blowing it up to keep people employed to do things, and they're in this situation where it's like classic Keynesianism economics, which is you bury gold and then you pay people to dig up the gold, and then they get the gold and you feel richer, even though you just buried the gold. It's just like this ridiculous way to run an economy, and I think China has a lot of those type of scenarios unfolding right now, and the only way out of it for them is to print money. And to be fair, that's what the US has been doing as of recently, printing money instead of trying to stimulate their economy, which is why we have a over 200% ratio of our GDP to debt. Ratio is over 200% right now, highest ever. We need to get growth going with spending down. China's in a very similar situation. So I think the way that
Even
they're going
higher,
to
I think, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, yes, they are. They're much higher. In fact, there's arguments that what they report is like, they could be hundreds of percent. Um, China controls a lot of their internal data, and we don't really know what's going on there.
Totally.
Long story short, with all this, they're going to print a ton of money to combat this and to try to artificially inflate their markets. And that could be disastrous for internal issues for China, but it could be actually very bullish for Bitcoin, for gold, and for assets that are traded in international markets. And so the US and many other markets in the West, or even in the East, could actually benefit from the Chinese printing, because what will happen is the Chinese don't want their currency because inflation is going to tick higher, and they're going to realize that the government's out of control with their financial policy. So they're going to run to safe haven assets, Bitcoin, gold, whatever else you want to point to, maybe even the NASDAQ. And those assets are going to rip, and they're going to rip because the Chinese are having an internal crisis, which actually is benefiting everybody else, which is crazy to think about. But I think there's a pretty strong argument that may happen.
Just in the same way that when we had an internal crisis, it benefited other people who are holding gold, who are holding Bitcoin, all these different things. It's a very unique, interconnected system right now. And what was explained to me, this is like now well over 10 years ago, when I was living in China, because the same thing was happening, right? They were building these cities back then, right across the border. You could go about a half an hour across the border and you could go see these cities that were empty. And the way it was explained to me was that they were thinking about the future and building it because they knew that if they built it now, people would come. But that is when you just pure supply and demand, if you're building all these things and they're not being filled up, or they're starting to lower the cost of housing, the moment that housing starts to drop and people have the primary chunk of their wealth in their house, people get upset. And, we see it in the US right now, even. Housing is not doing great. And I think that's actually one component of why the election went the way that it did. But interesting. So basically the prediction is China's internal stimulus is going to benefit internationally all the people that hold assets that the Chinese investor class is going to run to escape inflation.
Yes.
I like it. Bitcoin.
Money printer go burr, buy Bitcoin.
My prediction number 7. Trump wins, Zelensky loses big. I think this war in Ukraine ends, and it ends in pretty short order. I think they're going to make a deal. I think the deal is going to include Ukraine not getting into NATO. I think Russia is going to make a sizable territory gain. And I think at the core, everyone's going to hate the deal, right? Even Americans. I think the Russians are going to hate the deal. The Ukrainians are going to hate the deal. But at the core, it's going to be a deal that is relatively fair. But the person who's going to hate the deal the most is going to be Zelensky, because he really doesn't have much leverage. And that is at the core of any deal. The person with the least amount of leverage loses. And he is going to lose big. But even if he loses big, I think the Ukrainians are going to win because the war will be over, and there'll be more certainty going forward. And I think Trump is going to win because he's going to do it in a way that he can take credit for, because he's very good at taking credit for things that were done during his administration. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I think everyone loses more on this. The American public loses. We've spent over $200 billion on Ukraine, and there's a strong argument that it's actually been hundreds of billions of dollars more because of the military operations that we've had to spend on outside of Ukraine, but preparing for it. People don't realize this. We have military in Finland, in Poland, in Romania, all of our ships everywhere, and we've ramped up an incredible amount of military spending. We talked about in a previous episode about the DoD spending is up 10% since last year, and this is already on hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's not including the aid packages we've given to Ukraine. So I'm sure a decade from now we'll know the true numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 400 or 500 or more billion dollars that we spent on this entire Ukraine. And when I say we, I mean the U.S. taxpayer. So we lose big time on this because there's going to be an outcome which is good for human life, which is hopefully there's no more meat grinder going on in Ukraine. But it's a big loss. It's going to be a loss for Russia because they're going to not get what they wanted ultimately, and it's going to be the Ukrainians are losers all around. I don't mean them as losers personally, but this is a situation where it's just
the worst
horrible.
Possible scenario.
It's messed up. So yeah, I don't think that your prediction is off at all, and Trump ending this and losers being seen all around the table.
Cody, number 8, what's your prediction? What do you got?
Number 8, what do I got here? This one is a little conspiracy theory here, so let's get into it. I'm gonna predict that the U.S. declassifies a variety of let's say hidden stories, events, and historical happenings that have been classified for decades that will absolutely shock the U.S. public and to a lesser extent of the world. I think the world will be less shocked because
they'll be less shocked.
It'll be the people within their own country that'll be the most shocked. Obviously, the Kennedy assassination. Trump has said he's was going to release it, and then he found out about it when he was in presidency in his 2016 to 2020 stint, and he learned about it and said this is too much. The U.S. public probably shouldn't know about it. Let's just call it what it is. The CIA assassinated JFK, and if we know the real story of why they did that, the U.S. public would basically find out that the government killed its own leader, and the people who are in charge are not the elected leaders. It's this deep state. So that's one of them. The second one, I think, is the alien activity. I don't really know what's going to happen there, but I do think there's a ton
UAPs.
of events. Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying that we're going to uncover an alien body or proof that there's some extraterrestrial life, but I do think there's a bunch of studies that are going to be declassified of events that have happened, especially during the Cold War, that are extremely unsettling and with no real answers, but at least we'll get transparency on what the government actually knows about. And then I think we're going to get a lot of information on the activities of the U.S. government, specifically the CIA, meddling in foreign events. And when the truth comes out about that, there's going to be an extreme amount of anger, frustration, distrust, and reflection that the U.S. population is going to need to go through. And it's going to be very difficult. I think in the long run, it's going to be very healthy. It's going to be cleansing. It's going to be a process that the U.S. Needs to go through. but I do think, and I hope he does it. It's one of those things uncomfortable. We need to do it. I'm going to give a book recommendation for everybody. Read The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer, I think it is.
Hmm.
It's this story about the Dulles brothers, the two brothers. They were the leader of the CIA, director of CIA, and Secretary of State at the same time, and they were brothers. And this is
Wow.
during the Eisenhower administration. And these two brothers were basically working in tandem to not only infiltrate foreign governments and overthrow them on the CIA level, but then on the public level, the Secretary of State, Department of State level, going in and pushing U.S. influence. And you had this concerted effort by two different branches or two different departments of government that should not be working together, but obviously still are. And this book called The Brothers tells you about Iran, tells you about basically every single government we've overthrown during that time period. And it's extremely alarming. And it gives you a really good idea of why Iran hates the US so much right now. We screwed them over, and a bunch of other countries. So great book to read. Stephen Kinzer, I think he wrote it, and it's called The Brothers.
I think that also continues to go, kind of funnels in to your first prediction, which is U.S. turning towards isolationism. I think one of the outcomes of U.S. citizens understanding some of the underhanded, shady deals and things that the intelligence agencies have done will just lead to more public sentiment shifting towards isolationism. And I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's one of those things that is just kind of works. The tide is already going in that direction, and it's just going to continue to push it there.
Yep.
I really hope that some of this stuff gets declared. I really do. I really hope there's more transparency, and that we get to the bottom of some of these things. And I actually really hope that there's also some more transparency about what has happened over the last 4 to 8 years in the administration, and that there's actually some committees that do some good, honest work at trying to uncover some of the lies that have been told to Americans over the last 4 years.
Daylight is the best disinfectant.
It is. It is. Yeah. Well, I'll go to my prediction number 9. That is that the U.S. refinances its debt. And I think that Trump becomes laser focused at some point on this. One of the reasons why I'm focusing specifically on refinancing debt is that Trump is at his core a real estate guy. He understands refinancing debt extremely well. I don't think he understands other ways. I think this is just his core competency, and he thinks about the U.S. in terms of business. He thinks about it in terms of real estate, and it's very clear that if we refinance our debt at a lower rate, we would be in a better position. He wanted to do it his first term. They didn't do it. And I think that there's going to be a time over the next 4 years when rates are lower, and they may even be lower for a short period of time before going back up, which is actually my prediction, that there's going to be some pressure to lower rates, refinance the debt, and then raise them back up. And it's going to be kind of a combination of a couple of things that happen to lower our debt and make progress on it. We're going to have to cut some things, but that's my prediction. There's going to be some serious refinancing, and it's going to be looked back on as an incredibly positive, massive step. Adding the Bitcoin strategic reserve and refinancing our debt will be 2 major steps that we take, because those are both steps that are not going to be fought by the public.
Agreed. I will push back on a little bit, though. Lowering, I mean, Trump has publicly said that he wants to lower rates. I think that's going to be a real battle for him. Although
a huge battle.
I said him, but really it's the Fed, which is a whole other story that I could go into, which is eliminating the Fed altogether, which has actually been brought into the conversation now. Another great book for people to read, And the Fed by Ron Paul. That's like a cult classic. So if you haven't read that book yet and call yourself an investor, then you are not an investor. And The Creature from Jekyll Island. That's another great book. the idea that he would refinance debt, though, I think is a challenge, because if he does lower interest rates, or somehow the Fed lowers interest rates, we got to have buyers of that debt. And if people know what's going on here, you don't want to be getting caught purchasing debt at a super low rate, especially when China and many other countries are selling off U.S. debt at record levels there. So I think there's going to be a huge challenge there. However, what you're getting at, though, is I think a restructuring of our debt is very likely, whether that's a blend of lowering uh, interest rates to get some of that long-term debt locked in lower, as well as having a Bitcoin strategic reserve, as well as growing GDP, as well as on and on and on and on. Yes, I think he's going to do everything he can to restructure our debt. Because if we don't, we're screwed. If we don't, we're going to have major issues. We're going to have wild austerity measures implemented like Greece has, and we're going to have an enormous economic downturn, which will be borderline Civil War-esque because of the hardships that the U.S. population will have to go through. So yes, I completely agree. We have to restructure all that debt.
All right, Cody, number 10.
Number 10. Let's see, where am I at? The Philippines, Indonesia, and Brazil surprised to the upside. I'm not super stuck on those three countries only having upside, but I do want to bring those three countries to the table as a conversation point, because they're huge countries population wise. And I don't think, especially US investors, appreciate how big those countries are. And these countries have recently gone through some pretty big changes politically, and also, let's say, culturally. And Brazil's had a lot of problems recently. I think they have more problems to go through. The Philippines and Indonesia just elected a new president. The Philippines has a really young demographic. And my point with all this is that they have a relatively young demographic, all three of these countries, and they have a relatively hungry demographic, which is this younger group of people that want to work their way towards the first world and want to work their way towards a level of lifestyle that is on par with the US. I don't think they're going to get there, at least within the next 4 years, but I do think they're going to work as hard as they can. I say the people, and I hope they do. I hope they bust their asses, and I hope they have as much success as possible. So I think when you look at the markets right now and you consider these three countries, they're almost like you don't think about them at all. But I think they're going to be very surprising over the next 4 years, because at the end of the day, they have a ton of young people, and young people consume things and they work their asses off. And these three countries could see a lot of upside. And all three of them are also really resource rich. So there could be a lot of upside there as they are able to sell resources into the world.
Outside of these countries, are you bullish or bearish on foreign equities?
So foreign equities, emerging markets, are almost at an all-time low in valuation compared to the US and the West. So from an investor standpoint, this is very, very tempting to start allocating yourself towards emerging markets, just from a valuation point of view. The flip side, though, is I do think that a lot of these emerging markets are lacking significantly, not only on government and capital infrastructure, just meaning like rule of law. So there's that huge risk there, but also just on tech. And the reality is that AI, I know you had mentioned this before, AI eating the world and having a lot of these, let's just say technological innovations really, really accelerating the US. I think a lot of these countries are they're cheap for a reason, because they're going to miss out on a lot of that. I think one story that's interesting is Africa. Africa has like something like 4 or 5 of the top 10 youngest countries in the world right now. Nigeria, most notable. But like there's still a lot of turmoil there. So even though they're young and they're hungry and they want to, hungry like they want to work hard, they're still going to have a lot of internal turmoil that's going to be difficult. And I think there's going to be a lot of emigration from there. They're going to leave. They're going to go to the US. They're going to go to Asia. They're going to go to other countries where they have a ladder to climb with rungs that are much closer. They can get to the top much easier.
I think you're on to something with. I think the immigration. I think the immigration story 4 years from now is going to be very different than it was for this election. And to your point, it's like a ladder is the ability to go and immigrate from a country that has a lot of chaos and doesn't have a really good plan for going places, or doesn't have a blueprint for people having success. There's going to be so much demand for people coming to the US in 4 years from now. And with the border potentially being closed down, I think there's going to be a lot more competition, and I think the conversation 4 years from now is going to be a lot different. It's just not going to be a dominant part of the election at all. And I think that we'll be more discussing how do we attract better people, how do we filter all those things that are actual real conversations about immigration rather than just how do we stop the flow.
Yeah, and I think there's other parts of the world that are on the opposite end of this. I mean, you asked what countries I think are undervalued or have a lot of upside. I named Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brazil. Conversely, like Europe's in trouble. I know the Europeans listening to this are shaking their head like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." But their demographics are in a really bad spot. Their economy is slowing down. They have too much regulation. They got to look in the mirror and think like, how do we transform ourselves? And their immigration that they're having right now is disastrous for countries like France, like Germany, where you have a lot of this illegal immigration. So they need to reform how they're allowing new citizens into the country. They need to welcome a lot of new people, but have it merit based, or some system that allows people to come in that are going to accelerate their economy, not drag it down even further.
Yeah, I think that the EU is going to have a reckoning over the next 4 years, and they have to figure out how to. I mean, one thing that is at the core of that as well is you've got even deeper divide of cultures than there are in the U.S. I mean, there's differences between people who live in Mississippi and Washington State. There's cultural differences between Louisiana and Maine, but they pale in comparison to the differences in culture between Greece and Germany. Completely different. So I'm very interested to see what happens there. I agree with you that EU is in trouble, and it's going to be it's going to be an interesting ride. Do you have any bonuses?
I could go on for days. I'll add one larger macro thing. I'm obviously pretty bullish on the U.S. electing Trump. I think it's needed for all the reasons I've said in the past, but also the hopeful results. But I think a lot of countries are going to reflect on what's going on. I think Canada is going to swing hard right. Trudeau has absolutely obliterated the Canadian economy. I don't know if we can throw the chart up here. It shows the GDP of Canada since Trudeau got elected. It's like flatlined, and the U.S. has just accelerated. And they've got so many issues there. The Canadian population, I hope to God they reverse course. Conversely, that's a really big reason for it to be bullish on North America. If the Canadians do in fact change their direction, North America is going to be like a behemoth, energy rich, culturally rich, economically rich, intellectually rich.
Next year.
Yeah, their elections next year.
Yeah.
Same, and Mexico too. I know they have a new President Steinbaum. I don't particularly, I'm not a huge fan of her, but I do think that Mexico, US, and Canada working together is going to be a powerhouse. And by the way, Mexico and Canada are the US's largest trading partners right now. China is continuing to fall down the list. So North America is going to be unstoppable if Canada changes direction. And I say that I'm about Canada, but I also want to put it into context. Canada has its lower population than California. So people-wise, it's kind of a wash because they just don't have many people. But resource-wise, they're extremely resource-rich. And if they're able to work with the U.S., and Trump said this, that he'd make an exclusion for them on tariffs. So no tariffs between Canada and the U.S. I mean, unstoppable there. And then the last thing I'll say is I think several other countries in the coming years are going to elect Trump-like leaders. Not saying like the exactly like Trump, but have Trump-like policies, because they're going to see what happens in the U.S. and they're going to realize that, hey, I may not like what they say. I may not like the short-term effect, but I do realize the long-term effect is actually really good for the wellness of my country, whether that be Australia or the UK or whatever. What about you?
My bonus prediction is that Fauci goes to jail. That's my bonus. I think that his crimes are too abundant to be forgotten, and he becomes a scapegoat for the administration, for the previous administration, because they're not going. There is definitely a vocal minority who wants more scrutiny into what happened during COVID, right? But they're not going to punish a lot of the politicians that were in the previous administration. It's just not going to happen. But they may punish Fauci, and he'd be like the perfect face for a scapegoat for the last administration. And especially if there are some specific things that come out that he lied about, that he deceived about, which there are many. And I think he ends up becoming the scapegoat, and he's old. So it's really not that big of a deal when they think, they're like putting an older scapegoat in jail for take the blame for all of this stuff. Sentiments change. That's my bonus prediction.
We will see. I hope there's certainly reform in the health sector, as we talked about earlier. I'm less enthusiastic of jailing people, although I do think it would set a good example to not do the things that a lot of these people have done. But I guess we will see.
We'll see. All right. Here are our predictions. We're excited. It's a very interesting time right now, and we'd love to hear from you. So shoot us the best thing you could do is to go, if you're listening to this episode and you enjoyed it, is to go and write us a review. Go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, write us a review. We would love to hear from you. Tell us what you think, what we can do better, and we will see you on the next episode.
See ya.